So I sat here, perched upon this rock on a random beach, watching the sun sink over the horizon slowly, and I realised two things. One, I wasn't originally meant to be here. I was drawn here from a weird structure. I was actually meant to be getting B-roll of the crash satellite mission without the mission marker, but I was never going to do this at night without the mission marker, so that mission, it's failed. Two, this is currently the best feature in Star Citizen. And I don't mean sunsets, this planet, or the soundscape. I mean just sightseeing. And I'm finger air quoting this as we speak. Feature of Star Citizen, which is currently unparalleled. Nothing in the game is as polished or works as well or as frequently as being wowed by just the sights that simply exist. And I believe a lot of active citizens would agree with that statement. Further proof of this would be the music. I didn't put that there, it just started. All I did was lazily cut to the section of black at the start of the video for what I thought would be a good intro. The game somehow knew to cement the moment that now was the time for calm, now was the time for sightseeing, just to display its best asset. And this is filmed in 3.9, so you're not seeing the new shaders on the water here. Which spurred me on to make this video, or hopefully series. One with a name possessing an on-the-nose type jab at the main criticism of Star Citizen's development itself. However, instead of critiquing it, because, well, you'll find plenty of that elsewhere on YouTube, it's a series to dream even bigger, to solve actual problems and think up actual features, big or small, which will help fill out the universe and leave me as mesmerised or giddy and just plain optimistic about the future of this game as this sunset did. So without further ado, and before I begin explaining how this will work, let's roll the intro. Now I'm sure that you heard me in a bit before where I mentioned that we'll be dreaming bigger for Star Citizen, which might sound absurd given the scope of the game already, but stick with me and I'll explain. In Feature Creep, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on concepts. And I'm going to use the term concepts very lightly because in the Star Citizen community we're used to seeing imagery every time we hear that word. Something visual to glare at. Which won't always be the case here, but I'll be sure to provide illustrations or at least B-roll with the features I'm talking about. In Feature Creep, the word concept will just mean tangible ideas, which will or could one day be realised inside of the game. As a result, this means Feature Creep, where appropriate, will cover anything and everything from entire gameplay loops, upcoming spaceships and their uses, miscellaneous vehicles, actual locations in the verse, tools, mission types, all in all, anything that could be bullet pointed on a list as a feature for the game. All of the topics I'll be discussing you will often find have been either alluded to, openly talked about, or even confirmed by the devs to be something that one day will be making its way into the game. Then occasionally I'll throw a curveball idea, which will often make sense to include. Of course I'll let you decide whether they do or not in the comments below. In today's episode we're starting at the basics, items I'll often refer back to when talking about bigger topics such as improving exploration or how data running might work. Today we start on the first batch of player tools, the enablers of all gameplay outside of vehicles. Before we get stuck into today's main topic, I'd like to introduce somebody. You've probably seen this guy around the channel. We simply refer to him as the Duppy. I'll be using him in some of the illustrations you'll see throughout this series in order to help convey my ideas. But first, in order to suit the series, he needs a bit of a makeover. Perfect. If you're an active player or even just a bystander to the game, you're probably familiar with this bad boy. The Grey Cat Multi-Tool. A utility item in Star Citizen with an ironic name because currently it only does one thing. Ooh, shiny. And to be perfectly honest, it does that one thing really well. It's just today we're going to expand upon that with our first of the player tools, the scanning attachment, turning the multi-tool into a scanning tool. Now open screen is the default Grey Cat multi-tool with no attachments, and for visual reasons, just for something to look at, we're going to be adding to it. So when I hear the word scanning tool and I'm imagining a futuristic sci-fi hand tool, or for some reason I can't get my head around small rotating or moving parts and blue whirring lights and that electronic background buzz sound. So here's a mock-up I made earlier. And just to be perfectly clear, when I make a mock-up like this, I don't think this is exactly the way that CRG will implement it into the game. I don't just mean like visual looks. I actually think that CRG is more likely to implement this into the contact lens that players have on when they're not wearing a helmet inside of the game. I'll explain my logic behind this later. But for now, for at least the illustration, we'll use this attachment for the Greycat multi-tool. Now the use of the scanner is a very simple 3-step process. First, you equip it and point it at a scannable object. Second, you'd initiate a scan by holding down the trigger. And third, you'd receive information back on either display on the scanner itself or in another heads-up display such as the mobile glass. The reason I've started with the curveball that is the scanning tool is simply because in future videos I imagine this is the one that I'll refer back to the most, simply because of the application of the tool. It provides information to the player. Who owns that building? Who manufactures that spaceship? If I eat this harvestable, will it hinder or help my hydration rate? These are all questions which can be answered by the scanning tool, and I haven't even touched upon how they can impact entire gameplay loops, ranging from its uses in medical gameplay to exploration to data running within the verse. All concepts which I hope to explore in future videos, but for now we're just going to discuss the blockers for such an item being in the game. The first and most obvious blocker for the tool making its way into the game would be that it needs to be concepted, modelled and animated, potentially with a sound pass as well. CRG needs to get a good idea in their heads of how and where this tool will be used in order to implement it in the game. The second blocker is tech based, and upon hearing that you might have worried, but the turnaround on such a thing might be shorter than you imagine. And that's because there's a perfectly well working example already in the game in the form of the orbit mining attachment available for the Greycat multi-tool. The tech I'm of course referring to is the fact that the current mining tool can detect a suitable source within its given range, then provide live information on a heads-up display on the tool itself. Currently this is limited to small minables for the mining attachment itself, but will need to be expanded upon greatly, which leads nicely into the next blocker, item and asset tags. Easily the most time consuming blocker is here, as it doesn't relate specifically to the scanning tool itself. Instead, this means that every object that can be scanned by the scanning tool would need some form of information to spit out upon request. For harvestables, this could be nutrition information and how it will affect your character. For buildings, it could be an excerpt about when the building was established or who it's built by. And finally, if pointed at player, it could provide an overall view of their actor status system, or instead provide a list of the equipment they currently have on their person. These are just a few examples of how the system could work. The final blocker for the scanning tool will of course be where all of this information is stored, which brings us to the iCache. As far as we know in Star Citizen, the way the iCache will work, it will store the status and position of every item that's movable within the game. It's logically sound that alongside this information will be stored, say, a go fetch me request for the blurb of text that the scanning tool would spit back out onto the HUD every time it's used. This way, even with thousands of duplicate items existing across the verse, all the scanning tool will be pretending to do while it's scanning is actually just loading the information from the database that it found using the attached asset tag. This of course would have to work differently for anything that isn't a static object such as a player. As I mentioned before, I imagine we'll be coming back to the scanning tool in future videos to expand upon why exactly you'd want this in the verse. But I also mentioned earlier, this concept may not originate like this. So let's dig into why CRG may not want to have it in this form, at least as an attachment for the Greycat multi-tool. Let me paint a picture for you. You're fresh off a mission, clearing out an underground base from its security forces, and you've acquired a pretty hefty sum of UEC for doing so, and a nice level 4 crime stat to go with it. Fantastic. All this bloodlust and relentless murders got you thirsty. No, quite literally, you've lost a lot of blood and your hydration level's low. You actually need a drink. So you retreat to your favourite unlawful bar to quench his thirst. 15 minutes of waiting for the attendant to start derping out, and you get yourself that whiskey cola that you so desperately need. For the 4th billionth time, you got to take a sip and a familiar clink noise and an error message has appeared. You've forgotten to take off your helmet. Again. As you go to correct this issue, you notice a player entered the bar. You know they're a player because when I say entered the bar, I really mean ran full force into the room and idled. Because players run everywhere. Patience isn't one of our best qualities. Of course they noticed that you noticed, and now you're just eyeballing each other with this awkward tension in the air. And then they go ahead and do this.
Sure we go. Level 4. Very nice.
See the problem here? It's ridiculously obvious that this guy's checking if there's a bounty on your head. The cheek. So in true gun-ho style, shoot first and ask questions later. Another awkward stare off, this time with a hint of disbelief. A few blasts later with the trusty firearm and the problem solved. Great. As you can see, the fundamental problem with this concept being a physical tool is how blatant the action is and its general unwieldiness. So while I may have concepted it this way, it does make sense for the scanning feature actually to be implemented into a UI contact lens. The downsides of this may be that it may make the initial stages of game loops that involve the tool a tad too easy, leaving anyone without the information gained or has that information used against them at a severe disadvantage. This of course could be countered easily by making the time for a full scan take long enough time to be identified by somebody else. So the next time you see somebody gazing at you from a distance, you know it's probably not because they're wondering where you got that sweet helmet from. And that's it for today's episode of Feature Creep. We're a fairly new channel, so if you enjoyed what you saw today, please be sure to drop a like down below, comment with your thoughts, negative and positive, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more in the future, keep on doppying, and we'll see you in the next one.